All right, let's check out this video from 2015. It's called Common Core Math Explained. Has over 500,000 views on YouTube. And it's pretty split on the thumbs up and the thumbs down. And I know Common Core, well, it might be a little bit old news. People don't talk about it as much anymore, although I'm sure it's still taught in a lot of public schools throughout America. So let's check out this video.
If there's one question that parents ask me, just more than just about any other question, it is, why are they teaching math so much differently now than they did when we were growing up? Why don't they just teach the standard algorithms? Why aren't they helping kids just get to the answers and get them quickly? And why are they spending so much time on these things that seem so inefficient?
Now, this is a common point that he is addressing, the inefficiency problem. He says that a big criticism of Common Core is that it's more inefficient, more complicated than the traditional algorithms, the traditional methods in which we arrive at answers, particularly multiplication. And you'll notice if you watch this video, he doesn't argue against that. He pretty much, he seems to concede that Common Core is more inefficient and requires a lot more work to be shown than the traditional method.
And I have an answer to that question. And I'll start by saying, we have decades of research that shows that teaching people just to memorize algorithms and execute procedures hasn't worked. It's worked for a small group of people, but for most people, they don't like math, they don't enjoy math, they don't think they're good at math, they have a really hard time with it.
Now, I wonder what he means by this, because he's saying, oh, studies show. Well, by what standard do they not work? By what standard do the traditional, and I use traditional as a layman's term, I don't know what it's typically called, although you'll see what he's talking about when he shows the difference. But by what standard does it not work? Because it definitely gets you to the right answer when you apply the method correctly. When you do all the steps correctly, you do get the same answer, or not the same answer, you do get the correct answer every time. So what's the problem? Is it the algorithm that's making kids and students frustrated with math?
Because no one taught them to understand the concepts and why we're doing what we're doing. We didn't teach kids how to think. We just taught them how to do and execute in this misguided idea that we just need them to get to the answer as quickly as possible.
So here I think he brings up a valid point. He says that kids don't understand the concepts when applied to math. They're not taught how to think. They're just taught how to do. They don't understand what's going on when they do the math. And I'm just speculating here. I'm no expert on the issue of education or math, but judging by a lot of the books I've read in relation to this topic, I can't help but wonder, one, if it's the algorithms, if the algorithms and the methods of mathematics are the problem for kids not understanding math and not understanding how to think, or if it's John Dewey and the progressive approach to education, which has had a profound impact on teaching schools and public schools throughout the United States. So kids are taught how to do, not how to think. Reading Brad Thompson's essay, Are Killing Schools, Brad Thompson, who is a professor, I believe, from Clemson University, he talks about John Dewey and progressive education. He says, John Dewey proposed that students learn by doing, particularly if the doing is through group activities. Project teaching also means that rigorous testing of a body of knowledge is to be abandoned for activities such as journal writing, which is really just an exercise in values clarification. Progressive educators argue that children will be inspired through their interest in and engagement with real-life activities to learn the 3 R's and other subjects naturally,
as though by osmosis.
This putative epistemological justification for project teaching, however, is a cover for a deeper moral political reason that progressives favor this method. It is intended to develop the students social spirit. And as John Dewey said in his book, The School and Society, quote, "The mere absorbing of facts and truths is so exclusively individual an affair that it tends to very naturally pass into selfishness. There is no obvious social motive for the acquirement of mere learning. There is no clear social gain in success thereat."
Now that's fucked up.
And according to Leonard Peikoff's book, The Dim Hypothesis, truth, says Dewey, is that which conforms to the requirements of society's subjective actions. Thus, concepts for Dewey are not an important tool of knowledge. Integration through the use of abstractions is largely useless and can be harmful, he thinks, because it tends to draw men away from the complexities of the urgent present into the abortive search for some broad, inclusive principle that, precisely because it does abstract from differences, would be unable to offer the concrete guidance we need. No process of integration, Dewey says, whether Platonic or Aristotelian, can cope with each day's uniqueness. To succeed in life, man must throw off the crushing burden of principles,
incontestable theories,
and necessary laws. Even Aristotle's logic, Dewey remarks, having worked so well for so long, is overdue for a change.
My brain! My hot, stinging brain!
And John Dewey himself even said in his book, Reconstruction in Philosophy, logic, like philosophy itself, suffers from a curious oscillation. It is elevated into the supreme and legislative science, only to fall into the trivial estate of keeper of such statements as A is A, and the scholastic verses for syllogistic rules.
Oh, there you are! You forgot your thinking thingy.
So John Dewey, the father of progressive education, which has had a huge influence and impact on education in America, both public and private, John Dewey thought that Aristotelian logic is overdue for a change. He appears to think that the law of identity is trivial, and he also thinks that the absorbing of facts and truths, the acquirement of knowledge, is such an individual affair that it leads to selfishness, naturally leads to selfishness, which he's right about that, by the way. The acquirement of knowledge and thinking for yourself is a selfish act. Selfishness is often used as a pejorative, but that's why selfishness is good, because selfishness is based on reason. You have to acquire knowledge and think for yourself.
It's great to learn, because knowledge is power!
But John Dewey thinks it's bad because there's no social motive. There's no social motive for thinking for yourself and the acquirement of knowledge, because it just naturally leads to selfishness. And Leonard Peikoff talks about the blatant disregard for concepts in teacher schools in the United States in his book, Teaching Johnny to Think. Peikoff says, I quote from a book, Linguistics in Proper Perspective on Linguistics, written for English teachers by a modern professor. Quote, because we know that language is arbitrary and changing, a teacher's attitude toward non-standard usage should be one of acceptance. One level of language is not better than the other. This is why the term non-standard is preferable to substandard in describing such usage as he don't do it, was you there? A person who uses terms such as these will probably be penalized in terms of social and educational advancement in our society, however, and it is for this reason that the teacher helps children work toward and eventually achieve standard usage, perhaps as a second language, unquote. In short, Peikoff says, there is no correct or incorrect anymore. Not in any aspect of language. There is only senseless prejudice of society. Peikoff goes on to say, you might wonder how one teaches composition, the methods of expressing one's thoughts clearly and eloquently in writing, given today's philosophy of grammar and of concepts. I will answer by reading excerpts from a recent manifesto. Quote, we affirm the students' right to their own patterns and varieties of language. The dialects of their nurture, or whatever dialects in which they find their own identity and style, the claim that any one dialect is unacceptable amounts to an attempt of one social group to exert its dominance over another, unquote. If so, Peikoff asks, why does anyone need English teachers?
You know, that's a really good question.
Who issued this manifesto? Was it some ignorant, hothead teenagers drunk on the notion of student power? No, it was the National Council of Teachers of English.
These guys are a fucking disgrace!
And going back to Brad Thompson's essay, in the last 2 decades, a particularly virulent strain of progressive education known as Constructivism has infected America's schools. Developed by the pseudo-academics of America's education schools, Constructivism advances the notion that all knowledge is an arbitrary social construction.
What? What the fuck?
Based on the idea that children discover or create their own knowledge,
Dewey said your mind doesn't learn shit, it creates it.
Constructivism is responsible for initiating such perverse educational fads as the whole language reading technique and whole math. Beginning in the late 1970s, America's educational schools began training prospective teachers with a new method for teaching children how to read. Known as whole language, the new approach assumed that children could learn to read as naturally as they could learn to speak. Quote, because their ability to decode is largely automatic and subconscious, unquote. Ken Goodman, guru of the whole language movement, has described his approach this way, quote, whole language classrooms liberate pupils to try new things, to invent new spellings, to experiment with a new genre, to guess at meanings in their reading, or to read and write imperfectly. In whole language classrooms, risk-taking is not simply tolerated, it's celebrated. Unquote. Reading, according to Goodman, is nothing more than a psycholinguistic game. Simply put, Brad Thompson says, guessing has been given the epistemological status under the whole language approach.
What can possibly go wrong?
So bringing this all back to this gentleman here who is saying that we need these new algorithms, these new methods of teaching arithmetic to children, these new methods of trying to find the correct answer to difficult math questions. This gentleman says that children today, they have a tough time with learning math and algorithms because
no one taught them to understand the concepts and why we're doing what we're doing. We didn't teach kids how to think. We just taught them how to do and execute.
Given everything that we know about this goof, John Dewey, and his progressive education that's had a profound influence and impact on America's schools, both public and private, and its influence on teachers, schools, and universities in America. John Dewey, who thought that the mere absorbing of facts and truths, the acquirement of knowledge is too individual and naturally leads into selfishness, and that there's no obvious social motive for acquiring knowledge and thinking for yourself. John Dewey, who did not think that concepts were an important tool for knowledge and that integration was useless. John Dewey, who thought that statements like A is A are trivial and thought that Aristotle's logic, having worked so well for so long, is overdue for a change. John Dewey, who said that children learn by doing, not by acquiring information and knowledge.
Dewey said your mind doesn't learn shit, it creates it.
On top of that, the contempt and disregard for concepts and conceptual learning amongst intellectuals who teach America's teachers how to teach. And let me be clear, I am no expert on this topic. I am no authority on this topic. I'm just a layman. I'm just a curious guy who happens to read a few books related to this topic. So I am just speculating here. But talking about what this gentleman said, and he seems like a nice guy, he says that the problem is
no one taught them to understand the concepts and why we're doing what we're doing. We didn't teach kids how to think. We just taught them how to do.
I can't help but wonder what the real problem is here. Is it John Dewey and his intellectual errors? Or is it the algorithms that are the problem?
Really makes you think.
And this misguided idea that we just need them to get to the answer as quickly as possible.
And I think efficiency is a good thing. Who wants to spend more time than they need to on trying to figure out the right answer to a difficult math question. The goal should be to find a simple way to find the correct answer without relying on a calculator. And I think one of the big controversies with this issue is that these kids, they bring their homework and their assignments home and they ask for help from their parents, but because they have to do this this more difficult, this more inefficient process of figuring out the answer, and because their parents don't understand what the fuck is going on, it creates a lot of confusion. Because the parents, they might want to help their kids on their homework, and they might have the tools, they might know how to get to the right answer, but they can't use their method because they have to show that they understand this, what appears to be a more difficult method at finding the correct answer.
So let me start with a multiplication example, 2-digit multiplication. And as students, we may have learned it, or you've probably learned it, to do the standard algorithm. Line your numbers up vertically, and then start with the ones column and go. 4 times 5 is 20. We're not allowed to write the whole 20 here. We just write the 0 and bring the 2 up there.
And this is the method I was taught. I think many people were taught this until probably 10, 20 years ago, whenever Common Core started entering the public schools. And if children are taught how to conceptualize and how to understand concepts, then it should not be difficult to apply a math problem like this to concepts. The most simple way is with story problems. So you take a problem like this, 45 times 24, easy. So what, in schools, there's usually between 20 to 30 kids in a classroom. Just spell it out like this. Say the school has 45 classrooms. There's 24 students in each classroom. How many students are in the entire school? And we have this simple standard algorithm that works, that will yield the correct answer each and every time when applied correctly. And that's how you get kids to understand mathematics, that it is the science of measurement, that numbers represent existence in reality. And really, when you think about it, multiplication is just a simple form of addition. Instead of saying 45 plus 45 plus 45 24 times, you just take this algorithm, multiplication algorithm, and then you can get the same answer without going through the laborious task of trying to add up the same number 24 times.
So that's the first place where we're doing something that is kind of weird. Then we do 4 times 4, which is 16. We have to remember to add in the 2, which is 18, and we place that there. Again, we haven't really told anyone exactly why we're doing that, but that's how you execute the procedure. Then you put in your, what I used to call the placeholder 0, so you put a 0 here. And you move over to this number, and you do 2 times 5 is 10. You only write the 0, and then we don't need this anymore. We carry a 1. And then 2 times 4 is 8. We have to add in that 1, which is 9.
Now, he kind of skips over the placeholder part, but the placeholder is a concept because, and he's going to explain this in the Common Core method, but the placeholder, the reason why you put a 0 there is because you're not multiplying 2 by 5 or 2 by 45, you're multiplying 20 by 45 in this algorithm. So 20 times 45 would be 900, and that's how you get the answer down there. That's why you put the placeholder, because you're multiplying 2 by 45, but you have to remember to add the 0 at the end, because 2 times 45 is 90, add the 0, it's 900. But he's ignoring the concept of the placeholder when describing this particular algorithm. So my point is that it should not be difficult to explain the placeholder concept to children with this particular algorithm.
And then we add these all together, 0 and 0, 0. There's an 8, and here's 10. And it's 1,080. Hopefully that's right. Now, these days, before we teach kids the standard algorithm, we might teach them what's called partial products, where we're going to help them see what's going on with place value in these problems. So again, we'll start with 4 times 5, which is 20. And we'll just go ahead and write that whole thing right here, 20. That's the first part of the problem. The next is we're going to do 4 times this 4. But we're teaching students that this is not a 4. It is the digit 4, but when it lives in this column, it actually represents 40. 4 times 40 is 160. And you'll notice this is the 180 that was there. So there's nothing really different going on here.
See, he just says there's nothing really different. If you properly explain the placeholder, then it's the same thing.
Just in how they write it down. Then I have not 2, but 20 times 5, which is 100. And I have 20 times 40, which is 800. And you'll notice again, these two here are 900. That's just what we had there. We'll add them all up, and we will get 1,080 again. Now, you might say, well, this isn't very efficient. Look how many steps that was. Look how many things I had to write down. And you're right.
See, he admits that this takes more steps, that it's not as efficient. And so when it comes to the efficiency debate, he seems to concede it. Although part of me wonders if this is a better method of teaching kids conceptually, which maybe it is. Maybe it's easier for kids to think. Although when you look at some of the other styles of Common Core, it looks like a disaster. It looks like a total nightmare. But it's really, when you break it down, if you're able to explain the placeholder properly, it's really not different than the first algorithm.
But we now have a conceptual understanding of place value. We're not having to write numbers up here and scribble them out, which is a bit confusing. And we're still getting the same result. So we'll teach this to students first so they understand what's going on. Later we can teach them the shortcut so they can save a tiny bit of paper to get to this answer. But there you go.
See, and that's all fine and good. If a student finds it easier to multiply with this algorithm, that's all fine if you want to teach both. But I think the controversy, again, is that parents find it difficult to help their kids on their homework and understand what their kids are doing, especially when kids are forced to do this more inefficient, I should say less efficient, this less efficient, more difficult, more complicated process that their parents don't understand. So kids might struggle more because their parents aren't able to help them, because the parents are not able to teach math the way the parents understand it. So I think the main problem at hand is that kids are struggling to understand these difficult, more difficult ways of arriving at the correct answer, and their parents are unable to help them because they don't understand what the hell is going on. And on top of that, this is ignoring a much bigger problem, and that is the fact that America's educational system has been heavily influenced by anti-conceptual, anti-logic thinkers like John Dewey and his goons.